Hi, this is Lou. Welcome to my channel. And today I'm going to be exploring how many different textures I can make using watercolour and combining them with some other simple ingredients. So I've got an idea for a series of watercolour paintings that I want to do, and what I'd like to do is to make them quite minimal in their kind of construction, but then add in lots of different textures and different ways of working with watercolour into different sections of those paintings. Hopefully over the next few weeks you'll see what I mean as I start to develop that series and share that with you. But for now, what I want to do is to have a play with some different ways of introducing texture into watercolour. Now last week I played a lot with water and tried to find different effects you could get just using water. Today I'm introducing some other things too. So I've got my little set of watercolours here. I'm working with a fairly neutral palette, but this works with any colours, and actually it's really useful to do it with different types of colours, so you can work out how different colours behave, because there are differences between them. I'm working on a watercolour paper block, and I've got a fairly big round watercolour brush. And then I've got a few different things to try. So I've raided the kitchen and I've got some salt. I've just decanted them into these little pots. I've got some different stamps, and I'm going to try some methods of stamping. Again, I really don't know whether this is going to work, but I'm going to see what I can find out. And then I've got some tools for scratching into the paint. I'm going to try just a stiff bristled brush to see what that does, if anything. I've got a scalpel, just be careful with that. And this is an etching needle, so it's just a little sharp metal point on a stick. But anything kind of sharp and pointy that you can think of to use would work, so like the end of a compass or even a needle or something like that. Yeah. And I'm also going to just try with the blunt end of a paintbrush as well. So this is some moulding paste that I've had on the shelf for about 10 years. It'll be interesting to see whether it's still workable. I've also got some of this cling film or plastic wrap, whatever you call it. So a few things to play with here. So to this section I've just applied a little bit of this moulding paste. I'm just going to see if it works. So this is something you'd use generally with acrylics, and you'd put it on top of a canvas to create a little textured surface. And it says it creates an absorbent surface, which might be good for watercolour. So we'll see. Yeah, it might not do anything, but it'll be interesting to find out. So I've just spread a little bit on here. I'm going to leave it to dry, and then I'll paint on top of it and see what we get. All the experiments I'm going to do today, I'm going to do in sepia. So for this one I'm going to use some cling film. Now I'm sure you've seen people do this technique before. I have, but I've never tried it myself, so I'm going to give it a go. So all I want to do is to paint an area with the sepia and have some areas that are a bit wetter and some that are a bit more pigmented. Something like that. And then what you do with this technique is you use some cling film. I think Americans call this something else. You bunch it up and you place it down on top of your paint. And you leave it there until it's dry. You can probably get different effects by scrunching it up in different ways. I've done mine quite scrunchy. And we'll see how that looks. So while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to do some experiments with salt. Again, I'm sure this is something you've seen people do before. You put down wet paint and you drop salt into it. And then as it dries, the salt changes the texture of your paint as it absorbs water. So the water's absorbed at different rates near the salt, so you get interesting effects. So I'm making this fairly wet. Let's put a bit more colour at the top. Why not? And then I've got two different types of salt. So I wanted to see what effect you got with different types of salt. So this one is rock salt and this one is kind of fine, like table salt. Start with this one. So sprinkle that on. And I can already see that absorbing the paint. So let's do the same here, but I'll use the rock salt instead. So there we go. These are much bigger granules of salt. And yeah, you can almost see the paint going whoosh into the areas of salt. So you should get nice little kind of pale halos around them. But yeah, you kind of completely wait for it to dry before you try moving them or brushing them off or anything. So you've got to be a bit patient. Over in these two sections, I'm going to do some experiments with scratching into the surface. You're actually kind of damaging the surface of the paper when you do this, but the paint should kind of coalesce into the grooves that you carve into it. So I'm going to start with my sharpest things. So I've got a scalpel and I'm pretty sure I can make a very fine line by dragging along its end. But I can also use it on its side to scratch the paper like that. You get like a little white centre in the middle of that scratch mark. And then I'm going to try and be really kind of quite violent and scratchy with it. I'm just going to do another one. And I want to see what happens if I paint over one of the scratch marks that I've put in. Oh, that's interesting. Might do that with the second one up as well. There we go. Okay, so I've got some scratch marks that I haven't painted over and some that I have. Then I'm going to go in with the etching needle. And this does create like a nice fine line. Quite liking that. Let's do a loopy one. It's a bit hard to draw the loops. And the loopy one hasn't really shown up very well. I think maybe the paint down here is a little bit drier. It's slightly wetter up here than it is down here. So let's have another go at painting over that as well. And see whether that makes any difference. So yeah, I think you can see it a little bit better after I've painted it over. So now I'm going to repeat the same process, repeat the same experiment, but with slightly less scratchy things. So they're doing less damage to the surface of the paper. So first of all, I don't know whether this is going to do anything at all. Yeah, didn't really do very much. Let's see. See, can I make some marks by squidging it in? Not really. What I think I might do is wait for that to dry a little bit more and then see if it kind of a brush on a nearly dry surface works better. And then I'm just going to use the blunt end of a paintbrush for this bottom one. And actually that's quite nice. I'm getting a very similar mark to the etching needle. But maybe a little bit more, maybe it's got a little bit more weight to it. Again, I should try painting over some of these bits at the bottom, see if I get a kind of a deeper line. And I'll just wait for that to dry for a little bit, see if I can make any impression with the dry brush. Okay, giving this another go. Now it's a little bit drier. And I'm still not really getting any effect with this dry brush. Oh well, it was worth a try. What I want to try here is stamping. Now, you can stamp with acrylic paints, you can stamp with inks. I've never tried stamping with watercolour. I've made a little very simple homemade stamp with some craft foam on stuck to a piece of card, and I'm going to just try painting my watercolour on, and it's beading up, which I did expect. Right, let's try this. Do it that way. Oh, now that's quite interesting. Let's just do a bit more for the bottom of the page. I'm going to try and do some quite concentrated paint on these three. Let's give it another go. Yeah, that's quite interesting. So I've got really obvious stripes. They've got quite fuzzy edges and kind of lots of mottling on them because of the beading on the stamp, and because it's cold pressed paper, so it's got a kind of bit of a tooth and, well, it's got a bit of texture to it, and you can see a lot of that in the stamped image. I've also got these little wooden blocks which I thought I'd try as well if this worked. So let's have a go with this one. Oh, that's quite canny, that. Let's do that again. Well, that worked better than I thought it was going to. Let's do the little circular, spirally one. Huh, that's quite cool. Let's try a watery one. Yeah, a little splodgy, but you know, it's okay. Well, that worked way better than I thought it was going to. Okay, that's cool. For the last one, I'm going to paint over my one with the texture medium on it. Oh, and I'm really quite liking that. the paint's really showing up the texture. Now this one here is dry. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bristle brush and do some mark making with it in the wet paint. So normally I wouldn't use a brush like this for watercolour. But I can get a little bit of a kind of a dry brush texture from using that brush. Yeah, it's not as much as or as interesting as I thought it was going to be, but never mind. It's actually quite hard to get the salt off. It was kind of really stuck to the paper, especially the fine salt. But I think that's it all now, and I've taken the cling film off here. This is feeling nice and dry. I'm going to take the masking tape off, and then yeah, see what we're left with. So this is the moulding paste. It's got a bit of texture to it. The paint went on quite dark, but then it's dried a lot lighter, which I thought maybe it might, because the surface is essentially an acrylic, so you'll get the paint's kind of sitting in the low areas, and you can sort of see the edges of the textured area are highlighted. I quite like this. It looks like a kind of plaster effect or something like that. It's quite interesting, and I could definitely see me using this in a project. Probably one where I'll then go over the surface with varnish and some kind of protective things. So that's one to think about for that. This is the cling film, and I've got some lovely shapes in here. It reminds me of a lot like crystals. I think it's really, really pretty. It looks like a quartz countertop or something. It's maybe it's got little fossils in the stone. There's an awful lot going in there. I'm really liking that. The two salts. So this is the one with the rock salt, and you can see where the grains of rock salt were. Where I put lots of pigment, it's gone really dark, and then they've got like a light halo around those areas. I think I prefer it where it's a bit lighter, and I think you get different effects with this depending on how much water you use. So again, I think this is something to play with, perhaps on a bigger scale. I do like these little halos around the salt grains. I think I'd like them if they were bigger and spread out and a lot more kind of organic, but I do like it. I really like this. I think there's some lovely stuff going on in here. There's lots of kind of stuff that looks like veining or marbling. There's kind of subtle textures where there was kind of a bit more water, and then there's some interesting areas here where there was lots of there were big concentrations of salt kind of here, and then you've got these really interesting kind of like lines that appeared throughout the whole thing, but they're really soft and subtle. They're not like obvious. They're just, oh yeah, I like that. So here are my two experiments with scratching things. The bristle brush didn't really do very much. I wasn't too impressed with that. The scalpel, so when I started doing the scratching with the scalpel, oh, that's all right, you get some interesting marks, but when I painted over it, you've got some real darks in there contrasted with the quite light over the top, and it brings out the surface of the paper where it's scratched away some of the top of the surface of the paper, and I think that's really interesting. The etching needle, it's got some quite fine lines here, but it was quite hard to do curves with it. I actually prefer just using the end of a paintbrush, and I think these are nicer lines. They're not going so far into the paper, but you've still got the paint sitting in them. And I painted over this bit at the bottom again just to kind of try and bring out those marks a little bit more. But they're quite nice lines, I quite like them. The etching needle lines are a little bit more regular and a little bit more torn, but these ones are kind of quite soft and a bit more subtle. And then my stamping, this worked way better than I kind of anticipated. So I really quite like some of the effects and textures I've got in this stripy one. These ones actually came out really nicely as well, and I could see that, like, if you did a painting that was quite like loose and had kind of areas of different colour, you could use just some stamps on top of some areas to kind of just add a little bit of detail in those areas, and I think that could be interesting too. So if you'd like to join me in doing some experiments with texture, please let me know how you got on. If you've got different mediums, if you've got different ideas, or if you've come across things that I haven't included here, then do let me know. I'm always interested. So thanks very much for watching today. I really hope that you found this helpful. I thought this was a really fun experiment to do, and I got some really interesting textures and some really unexpected results as well. I'd love to know if you do these kind of experiments with different textures and the different effects that you can get with watercolour. I'd also be really interested to know if there are other things that you use to get different texture effects. I know that I haven't explored the full range of what's available. There are different mediums that I want to try, different types of pastes, all sorts of things that could create really interesting effects. So I'd be really keen to know if you have any favourites. If you've liked what you've seen today, then in my next video, which is coming very shortly, I'll be running through an exercise in which I use some of these textures to create a piece of art. That's something that you could follow along with, and I'd love to see what you do with it. So if you're not already subscribed, then do hit the subscribe button to get a notification when that pops up. Thanks very much for watching today, and I'll see you soon. Thanks, bye-bye.